Sir.
Tom McNeil, Virginia Public Radio. I'm just taking an excerpt from this news release from the Sierra Club saying science of climate change is based on thousands of scientific papers by more than 2,000 scientists all over the world who participate in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now with that said, the issue of climate change, it has been debated, will continue to be debated. There are many who use the argument that instead of the state or the government, federal government, erring on the side of caution, listening to these different agencies and scientists, they'd rather take a risk at the cost of long-term effects. What is your response to those who make that statement?
Can you repeat the question before you answer, please?
I will recap the question. You tell me if I get it right. What is my response to the concern raised that, and I'm not sure which side of the coin you're looking at, that either acting or not acting holds repercussions and balancing those two? Am I more or less encapsulating it? I mean, there's two ways to look at this. Either the conclusions are correct even if the process by which those conclusions were drawn is utterly flawed, which we won't know until we actually apply a real scientific process to reviewing this, and then there would be man-made global warming that we can affect by these regulations. It isn't enough that it exists. We have to be able to do something about it. And not acting would have potential environmental consequences. The other side of that coin is that there is no concludable basis upon which to say that man is creating global warming. And then going forward with such draconian regulation imposes its own costs. I would point out that one of the most important ways that mankind has improved itself over the years is through the application of free market principles and how they have raised the standards of living around the world. It is the countries that have implemented those principles for the longest time that put the most effort into keeping their environment clean, into keeping the world environment clean. The United States is one example. It is part of why the debate between developing or developed and underdeveloped countries is so challenging, is because once you become a developed country, you tend to maintain your environment a whole lot better than while you're trying to get there. In light of the complete unreliability of the process by which the conclusions the EPA reached was undertaken, and the incredible economic consequences that affect the health and welfare of every Virginian, every American, it behooves us to go back and do this right. Again, we're not prejudging the outcome, but it's very clear that the process by which this has been undertaken is not one that was set up to reach an objective conclusion. You noted some quotes from people about science in other parts of the world. The science itself is weakened here. The people who are at the center of this whole controversy and are relied on to have gathered the data that is relied upon, were actively pressuring scientific journals, other outlets, to not peer review, not publish skeptical perspectives other than their own. This wasn't the pursuit of truth, this was the pursuit of it. It was political science, not science in the typical sense of the word. I mean, you've got people who were authors in the IPCC reports. John Christie. The temperature records cannot be relied on as indicators of global change. That from one of the authors of the IPCC report. Most famously this past weekend, Phil Jones' interview in Britain. He was the director of the Climate Research Unit. And he said, I don't believe the vast majority of climate scientists think that the debate on climate change is over, which is sort of this underlying assumption. So we have a long way to go to get to a point where a reasonable conclusion can be drawn. Sir.
Ray Reed, Lynchburg News and Events. Since you're taking this action, does it portend future actions on other EPA initiatives such as Chesapeake Bay cleanup?
Well, this one stands by itself. I think it's somewhat unique because of the extraordinary role of corrupted science in their reaching their conclusion. Certainly we would want to see a rigorous scientific basis for anything that EPA does, but how it plays out in the Chesapeake arena is a whole other question. The concerns we have here are not ones that I would hope would be mirrored ever again. Of course, if they are, we will take appropriate action at that time. But I hope and expect that this is an anomaly, and it'll remain as such.
Larry Odell, AP. You mentioned the data on which the EPA actually placed the reported use of the doctor. Can you elaborate
Anyone else
on
have a question, Mr. Attorney General?
Yes, there's a question from Larry Odell of AP. He's asking me about my comment about the use of doctored data. And my reflection there is if you look at the scores of weather stations, for instance, used, the data used from those as a baseline, CRU explicitly did not use the temperature data that directly came. They didn't use the raw data. They applied their own, what we would call in engineering, fudge factors, but they created multiples, coefficients to multiply those by to come up with a data set that then they used as the basis for analysis. I mean, right from the very beginning, from the baseline, we now know that they were altering their own raw data before they conducted analysis. And at the same time, rather aggressively going after those scientists who questioned that approach and blocking them from publication, which is a critical element of the peer review process. So, Ross.
Mr. Attorney General, this is Joe Campbell. Can I just do this?
Okay, Joe, just 1 minute. We've got one more in front of you, and then I'll come to you.
You mentioned not wanting to prejudge any future scientific inquiry, but you've mentioned many times in your past your own position that you don't believe that climate change is man-made. Does that remain your position that climate change is not man-made? And what role does your personal feeling on that have in this action?
Well, Phil Jones, going back to this guy who's the director of CRU, has pointed out the same thing that I did during my campaign. I said during the last 10 years, he said during the last 15 years, global warming has not occurred on Earth. And that's just what the data show. He also noted that if you go back, there was a period of warming from 1860 to 1880, 1910 to 1940, 1975 to 98. You can pick slightly different years in there. I would say 79 to 95. Again, just looking at temperature data. But that goes back to data, and then you draw conclusions from it. The people at the very center of this data gathering are making the same sorts of statements that I have with respect to the recent past data. Now, mind you, when you're talking about trends, if you want to look at 100 and 200 and 300 year slices of time, you know, that changes your perspective. My focus has simply been on this past decade or so. And I hear some of these folks who are driving the man-made climate change, man-made global warming bus, if you will, saying themselves that in fact in the last decade there hasn't been global warming. Forget why, it just hasn't been here. You know, I don't think I'm in bad company in that respect when I'm standing with people who have been advocates for one particular position that is at the center of this controversy.